There are 12 nets drying on a beach at sunrise, and not one of them belongs to a saint. They belong to fishermen. To a man who collects taxes for an empire he privately serves and his own people privately despise him for it. To a man who has spent years, in one form or another, associated with a movement plotting to burn that empire to the ground. You are looking at a lake in northern Israel called Galilee, in a small, unremarkable province at the edge of the largest empire the world had ever seen. And you are looking at the most ordinary group of coworkers in human history, about to be handed the most extraordinary job ever given to 12 men. This is not a story about halos. This is not a story about stained glass windows and soft golden light. This is not a story about distant, perfect men who never doubted, never argued, and never flinched when things got hard. This is a story about who they actually were before anyone called them saints. Their trades, their tempers, their politics, their fear. And about how, one by one, almost all of them died for refusing to say it wasn't true. One of them, before this is over, will walk farther from home than any of the other 11, past every border his neighbors back in Galilee had ever heard of, into a country most of them couldn't have pointed to on a map. We will get to him. But not yet, because to understand what these 12 men gave up, you first have to understand what their lives looked like the day before everything changed. Picture the lake itself for a moment, because it matters. Galilee isn't some vast, anonymous sea. It's a modest freshwater lake, roughly 13 miles long, ringed by fishing villages close enough that everyone on the water knew everyone else's boats by sight. Fishing here wasn't a hobby or a side hustle. It was a licensed trade, taxed by Rome like everything else, worked in family crews that went out at night when the fish came closer to the surface, hauled in nets by hand until their shoulders gave out, then spent the daylight hours mending torn nets and selling the catch before it spoiled. It was hard, repetitive, physical work, done by men who mostly couldn't read, who spoke Aramaic at home and maybe a little rough Greek for trade, and who had almost certainly never left this province in their entire lives. That's the pool Jesus draws from, not the religious elite in Jerusalem, not scholars trained since childhood in the finer points of the law. Working men from a region the rest of the country considered a backwater. There was even a saying at the time, preserved in the Gospel of John, that nothing good comes out of Galilee. Whoever built this movement started by recruiting exactly the people polite society would have overlooked. Here's what most people miss. The word apostle is not a religious title you're born into, and it's not a compliment. In Greek, it's apostolos, someone who is sent, not someone who volunteers, not someone who applies for the position, someone who is picked up out of their ordinary life, pointed in a direction, and sent, usually toward something dangerous. 12 very different men got picked up that way, on that beach, in that province, under that empire. And almost none of them got to grow old. To understand why almost none of them got to grow old, you need 30 seconds of context nobody gives you in Sunday school. By the time Jesus starts calling these men, Judea has been under direct Roman control for decades. A small, occupied, deeply religious province governed by a Roman procurator, garrisoned by Roman soldiers, and taxed by a system designed to squeeze as much money as possible out of people who never voted for any of it. Rome didn't usually collect its own taxes directly. It auctioned off the right to collect them to local men, who paid Rome a fixed amount up front and then kept whatever they could extract above that as personal profit. That system produced exactly the kind of men you'd expect, and it made tax collector one of the most hated job titles in the entire region, because a tax collector wasn't a foreign oppressor. He was your neighbor, taking your money for the people occupying your homeland. On the opposite end of that same tension sat a movement the historian Josephus describes as the fourth major Jewish faction of the era, alongside the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. A group history remembers as the Zealots. Josephus describes them as burning with what he calls an insatiable passion for liberty, a conviction that paying tribute to a pagan emperor was itself a betrayal of God. They weren't a peaceful protest movement. They were, at least in their more extreme wings, willing to use violence against Rome and against any of their own countrymen who cooperated with it, which meant, specifically, that tax collectors were one of their most hated targets. Keep that in your head. You're going to need it in about 10 minutes, because Jesus is about to put a tax collector and a man associated with that exact movement at the same dinner table for 3 years, and almost nobody talks about how strange that actually was. But first, the water. Start with the two brothers who never left the boat business willingly. The Gospel of Luke gives us the actual scene of how Simon gets pulled out of that life, and it's worth slowing down for. Simon has fished all night and caught nothing. An exhausting, discouraging shift with empty nets to show for it. When Jesus, teaching a crowd from Simon's own boat, tells him to push out into deeper water and try again. Simon, tired and almost certainly skeptical, points out that they've already worked all night for nothing. But he does it anyway. And the nets come up so full they start to tear, so full that Simon has to signal a second boat just to help haul in the catch, and both boats nearly sink under the weight of it. Luke says Simon's reaction isn't excitement, it's fear. He falls at Jesus' knees and says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Jesus' answer is the line that redirects Simon's entire life. Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching people instead of fish. Simon, Andrew, James, and John all leave their boats, their livelihood, their family business, everything they know, right there on the shore. Simon is a thick-built fisherman from a town called Bethsaida, married, working the family trade on the Sea of Galilee alongside his younger brother Andrew. He's not educated in the formal, rabbinic sense. He's the kind of man whose hands are permanently rope-burned and sun-cracked, who smells like fish and salt water more often than not, who says exactly what he's thinking before he's thought it through. And he's the one Jesus renames on the spot. Jesus calls him Petros, rock. It's either the highest compliment in the Gospels or the driest joke in them, because for most of the story, Simon Peter is anything but steady. He argues with Jesus in front of the other 11. He panics and starts sinking the one time he tries to walk on open water toward him, and on the single worst night of his life. Hours after swearing he would die before he denied knowing his teacher. He denies it 3 separate times to 3 different strangers, the last time with a curse, while Jesus is being interrogated a few dozen yards away. Then a rooster crows, and Peter remembers the exact words Jesus said to him earlier that night, and the Gospel of Luke says simply that he went outside and wept bitterly. That should have been the end of Peter's story. It isn't. Something happens after the resurrection that turns the man who broke down crying in an alley into the man who stands up in front of a hostile crowd in Jerusalem just weeks later and will not sit back down. He becomes, by nearly every account, the de facto leader of this scattered, terrified little group in the earliest and most dangerous days of the movement. The one who preaches first, who gets arrested first, who keeps standing back up first. Tradition. And here it's important to say clearly this is not scripture. This is early church tradition, recorded by the theologian Tertullian around the year 200 and repeated by Origen a generation later. Holds that Peter is eventually arrested in Rome itself, under the Emperor Nero, sometime in the mid-60s, in the years after a great fire swept through the city and Nero needed someone to blame. And when the moment comes to be executed the same way his teacher was, upside down, tradition says Peter requests one specific adjustment: turn me the other way. I am not worthy to die facing the sky the same way he did. Whether or not you believe every detail of that account, sit with the shape of it for a second. This is the same man who, 3 decades earlier, denied even knowing Jesus to keep himself safe. By the end, he is reportedly asking his executioners for a harder death, out of a sense that even dying the same way as his teacher would be too great an honor for him. That is not a small character arc. That is one of the widest swings in this entire story. His brother Andrew doesn't get nearly the same attention, then or now, and there's something almost fitting about that, because Andrew's entire role in the Gospels is to bring other people forward and then step back into the crowd. He's the one who hears about Jesus first and goes and finds his brother Simon to bring him along. Quietly, almost as an afterthought, the way you might text a friend, "You have to meet this guy," and then fade out of your own story entirely. He does something similar later with a boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish, and again when some Greek visitors want an introduction to Jesus. Every single time Andrew appears in the text, he's connecting someone else to something bigger than himself. The historian Eusebius records Andrew preaching in the region north and west of the Black Sea, an area the ancient world called Scythia, later tradition. The kind serious historians treat with real caution, because it comes from a text composed a century or more after his death. Claims he was eventually crucified in the Greek city of Patras, on a cross shaped like an X rather than the traditional Roman cross. That shape still carries his name today, on flags and coats of arms across the world, though the earliest solid history simply loses track of him somewhere on the road, doing the same quiet work he always did. Introducing, connecting, stepping aside. Now go to the other set of brothers in the boat, and here the story gets sharper, because for once the Bible doesn't leave us guessing at all. James, son of Zebedee, and his younger brother John are also fishermen, working the same lake, and Jesus gives them a nickname too. Boanerges, which the Gospel of Mark translates as sons of thunder, that tells you almost everything you need to know about their temperament. At one point, when a village refuses to welcome Jesus, these two ask, with what can only be described as enthusiasm, whether they should call down fire from heaven to destroy the place. They are loud, quick-tempered, ambitious. At one point, their own mother asks Jesus to guarantee them the 2 best seats in his coming kingdom, which does not go over well with the other 10. The Gospel of Mark records their own version of that same leaving everything moment. James and John are in their boat with their father, Zebedee, mending nets. A family fishing operation successful enough that they employ hired hands, which tells you this wasn't the poorest family on the lake, when Jesus calls them, and they simply leave. Mark's account specifically notes they left their father standing in the boat with the hired men. No goodbye speech, no negotiation period. It's one of the more quietly brutal details in the calling stories. The cost wasn't only theirs to pay. Their father watched 2 sons walk off the boat and down the shore, and that's the last we ever hear of him in the text. James is the one whose death the Bible actually records, in plain, unadorned, almost clinical language in the book of Acts. No parable, no vision. Just one sentence. Herod Agrippa killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, a king, a blade, and a man who apparently wouldn't recant, sometime around the year 44, roughly a decade after the crucifixion. That makes James the very first of the 12 to die, and the only one whose martyrdom the New Testament states as plain historical fact rather than later tradition. The early theologian Clement of Alexandria, writing a century and a half later and preserved for us by Eusebius, adds one detail worth sitting with. He says the soldier assigned to escort James to the place of execution was so shaken by James's composure, by the fact that this man, on the way to his own death, showed no fear at all, that the soldier declared himself a Christian on the spot and was executed alongside him that same day. Whether every detail of that story survived 2,000 years intact, the core of it captures something true about how this whole movement kept spreading. Not through arguments, but through witnesses watching how people died. Here's what most people miss about John, James's brother. He is the only one of the 12 who does not die a martyr's death. Everyone else on this list, with one further exception we'll get to, is killed. John is exiled instead. Later tradition places him on Patmos, a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea, sent there under a later emperor, Domitian, for the crime of refusing to stop talking about a man Rome had already executed. It's on that island, old, alone, cut off from every friend he'd spent his life with, that John writes the last book of the Bible. A vision full of fire and thrones and a city coming down out of heaven. Some traditions claim Rome tried to kill him first, back in the city itself, that he was thrown into a vat of boiling oil outside one of the gates of Rome and simply walked out unharmed. Historians treat that detail with real skepticism. But underneath the legend is a fact nobody disputes. John outlived every single other person on this list, some of them by decades. He watched almost everyone he loved get killed for the same thing he believed, and he kept living and kept writing into old age. The emperor who exiled him, Domitian, ruled Rome in the final years of the 1st century and is remembered by Roman and Christian historians alike as one of the more paranoid, self-glorifying rulers to hold the office. He insisted on being addressed as Lord and God, which puts an entirely different weight on why an elderly Christian on a prison island might have spent his final years writing about. A very different kind of Lord and a very different kind of throne. John, on that island, alone, with everyone he'd walked beside for decades already dead, chose to write about hope instead of despair. Sometimes surviving is its own kind of hard road. Maybe the hardest one on this entire list, if you think about what it costs to be the last one left, still believing, with no one left who remembers it the way you do. That's 4 names down, and already the pattern should be clear. A temperamental fisherman who denied his teacher and still became the rock of the entire movement. A quiet brother who spent his whole life introducing other people to something bigger than himself, and 2 brothers nicknamed after thunder. One beheaded within a decade, the other outliving all of them. If you're finding this as strange and human as I did putting it together, stay with me, because we're only a third of the way through this list. And it's about to get stranger. Stay with me, because this is where the group stops being predictable and starts being genuinely strange. Philip is careful, almost bureaucratic in temperament. He's the one who does the math out loud when Jesus asks the group how they're possibly going to feed a crowd of 5,000 people with nothing on hand, and Philip's answer is essentially a budget report. It would take more than half a year's wages, and even then it wouldn't be enough. He's a planner in a group full of fishermen. And it's Philip who goes and finds a skeptical friend of his named Nathanael and more or less drags him over to meet Jesus. That friend, Nathanael, who appears in 3 of the 4 apostle lists under a different name, Bartholomew, is blunt to the point of rudeness. His first recorded line about Jesus is basically an insult. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth, at the time, was a nowhere town, and Nathanael says the quiet part out loud. Jesus' response is the kind of line that ends an argument before it starts. He looks at this stranger and says, "Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is no deceit," recognizing, apparently, the very honesty that had just insulted him. Both men end up a long way from that riverside conversation, and one of their endings is genuinely hard to hear. The earliest source we have on Philip's death is Polycrates of Ephesus, writing around the year 190, preserved for us because Eusebius quoted him directly. Polycrates simply says Philip fell asleep, an early Christian euphemism for death, in a city called Hierapolis, in what's now modern Turkey. No details of martyrdom, no drama, just a place and a fact. Later, less reliable apocryphal writings add that he was crucified there, sometimes upside down like Peter, but the earliest solid record doesn't confirm that. Bartholomew's story is the harder one, the strongest and oldest tradition, recorded across multiple independent sources, including Eusebius, sends him on missionary journeys through Mesopotamia, Parthia, and eventually to Armenia, where he's said to have healed the sick, cast out what the accounts describe as evil spirits, and converted a local king named Polemius. That conversion enraged the king's brother, a man named Astyages, who feared it would provoke a Roman backlash. Astyages had Bartholomew arrested, and the tradition, repeated across nearly every ancient and medieval source on his death, states that he was flayed, meaning skinned alive, and then beheaded. It's one of the most brutal deaths attached to anyone on this entire list. Renaissance painters were still depicting it 1,500 years later. Michelangelo included Bartholomew, holding his own flayed skin, in the Sistine Chapel. Here's the part nobody tells you when they show you that painting. This is the same man who, a few years earlier, was standing under a fig tree, mildly annoyed that anyone expected him to be impressed by a preacher from a town he'd already decided wasn't worth taking seriously. Now put 2 men side by side who, on paper, should never have shared a meal, let alone a mission. And remember everything I told you a few minutes ago about tax collectors and zealots, because this is where it matters. Matthew, also called Levi in 2 of the Gospels, is a tax collector, working a customs post, most likely on the trade road running through Capernaum, collecting tolls on behalf of the very empire occupying his homeland. In 1st century Judea, that makes him more than unpopular. It makes him, in the eyes of his own people, a collaborator. A Jewish man skimming profit off his own countrymen to fund a foreign occupation. Religious leaders considered tax collectors ritually unclean. Courts wouldn't accept their testimony. When Jesus walks up to Matthew's booth and simply says, "Follow me," and then goes to eat dinner at Matthew's house with a room full of Matthew's tax collector friends, the religious establishment's reaction is immediate outrage. Why is this man eating with sinners? Simon carries the title, the Zealot, in 2 of the 4 apostle lists, and in 1st century politics that wasn't a personality description. It identified him, at least at some point in his life, with the exact movement Josephus describes. Men willing to use violence and intimidation against Rome, and against any Jew who cooperated with Rome. Tax collectors were one of their specific, named targets, which means Jesus put a Roman tax collector and a former, or perhaps not entirely former, anti-Roman militant at the same table, sharing meals, sharing a mission, for 3 straight years. That's not a footnote in this story. That's one of the strangest and most quietly radical details in the entire New Testament, and almost nobody stops to notice it. Think about what that actually required, day to day, for 3 years. It's not simply that Matthew and Simon disagreed politically. Simon's entire movement considered men like Matthew traders worth targeting. Matthew had spent years building a life, a profitable one, by every account, collecting money from people who, in Simon's world, deserved to be liberated by force from exactly the system Matthew worked inside. These weren't two men who happened to vote differently. These were two men whose respective causes viewed each other as enemies, and the Gospels never record a single argument between them. Not one. Whatever reconciliation had to happen between a tax collector and a zealot simply happens off the page, somewhere in those 3 years of shared meals and shared roads, and none of the Gospel writers thought it was interesting enough to write down. Which might be the most quietly remarkable detail in this entire list. Matthew goes on to write the Gospel that carries his name. The most detailed single account we have of Jesus' life and teaching, composed by a man his own countrymen once refused to speak to in the street. His death is genuinely, honestly uncertain. The earliest sources we have, including the 3rd century writer Hippolytus and Eusebius after him, simply say he fell asleep in a place called Hyres, without describing how, which suggests the earliest church didn't actually have a martyrdom account for him at all. Centuries later, less trustworthy traditions filled that silence in with a claim that he was speared to death in Ethiopia. The honest answer is, we don't really know. Simon the Zealot's ending is even less documented. Most traditions send him, alongside another apostle we're about to meet, toward Persia on a shared mission. And most traditions agree it did not end peacefully, though the specific details of how he died vary so widely between sources that historians treat almost all of them as unreliable. That apostle he's traditionally paired with is Thaddaeus, also called Jude, and specifically labeled in Luke's Gospel as Judas, son of James. A careful clarification that exists for one obvious reason, so that nobody, reading this centuries later, confuses him with the other Judas. He's one of 2 of the quietest names on this entire roster. The other is James, son of Alphaeus, sometimes called James the Less, not as an insult, but simply to distinguish him from the more famous James, son of Zebedee, whose death we already covered. Outside of his name appearing on the list 4 separate times, the historical record on James, son of Alphaeus, goes almost completely silent. No recorded words, no recorded scene. Just a name that shows up, again and again, in every single list of the 12. Tradition, thin as it is, sends both Thaddaeus and Simon toward Persia together, and sends both of them to a violent end there. Clubbed, according to some accounts, or worse, according to others. The details genuinely conflict from source to source in a way that should make you cautious about any single version you hear. What doesn't conflict, in any version, is the shape of the pattern. Obscurity, their entire lives, and a full cost paid anyway, off camera, without anyone writing down exactly how. That's 11 names now. 9 deaths we've walked through in real historical detail. 2 we've had to admit the record barely preserves at all. If you're keeping track, notice what's missing from that list so far. Not one of these 11 recanted. Not the ones with detailed accounts. Not the ones with almost no record at all. Whatever happened to each of them individually, none of it produced a surviving account of any of them taking it back. There's one more name before the ending, and this one isn't comfortable, and it shouldn't be. 12 men followed Jesus for 3 years. One of them held the money bag. Judas Iscariot was the group's treasurer, trusted enough to manage their shared funds. For 30 pieces of silver, roughly the price the law placed on a slave, he agreed to identify Jesus to the religious authorities, and he did it with a kiss. A gesture that, in that culture, meant friendship, loyalty, welcome, turned deliberately into a signal for soldiers waiting in the dark. What happened to Judas afterward is one of only 2 apostolic deaths the Bible states as direct fact rather than later tradition. The Gospel of Matthew says that after seeing Jesus condemned, Judas was seized with remorse, tried to return the silver, and then went out and hanged himself. The book of Acts, written separately, adds a second and harsher detail, that his body later fell in a field bought with that same silver and broke open. Scholars have debated for centuries how exactly to reconcile those 2 accounts, but neither one softens the ending. Both agree on the essential fact. Judas died by his own hand, in grief, apparently unable to live with what he'd done. This is not a story about a villain who was never really one of them. This is not a story about an outsider who slipped in unnoticed and fooled everyone. This is not a story about someone it's easy to write off as fundamentally different from the other 11. Judas ate at the same table, walked the same roads, was trusted with the group's money, and he still made a choice the other 11 refused to make, and it cost him everything, in a way none of the other apostles' deaths did. Theirs were inflicted by enemies who hated what they believed. His was self-inflicted, by a man who apparently could not survive what he'd done to someone he had walked beside for 3 years. His absence left a gap so real that the remaining 11 felt they had to fill it before they could move forward. In the earliest days after the resurrection, they gathered and cast lots. An old, established method of decision-making, trusting God to choose between two candidates rather than voting on personal preference. And the lot fell to a man named Matthias, someone who, the text specifies, had followed Jesus from the very beginning of his ministry, whose name had simply never once been singled out in any of the gospel stories. Eusebius records that he was later sent to preach in Ethiopia. Beyond that, history goes almost as quiet on him as it does on James, son of Alphaeus. Not every apostle gets a dramatic ending, or even a clearly recorded one. Some of them just get the job, quietly, and do it for the rest of their lives, off camera, unremembered by name outside of a single list. And now, finally, we come back to the one this story opened with. Thomas. In Greek, Didymos, meaning twin, which is actually his real name and not a nickname, though almost nobody realizes that, earned a reputation that has followed him for 2,000 years because of one specific moment. When the other 10 apostles told him they'd seen Jesus alive again, days after watching him die, Thomas refused to believe it. Not out of stubbornness for its own sake, but out of a kind of protective grief. He'd watched a man he loved die in public, slowly, brutally. He wasn't going to let hope trick him into that kind of pain twice. He said, plainly, that unless he could put his own finger in the wounds, he would not believe. A week later, Jesus appears again, this time with Thomas in the room, and holds out his hands. Thomas doesn't argue. He doesn't run the test he demanded. He looks, and he says 4 words that Christians have repeated for 2,000 years since, "My Lord and my God." Here's where the open loop from the very beginning of this video finally closes. According to the earliest non-biblical account we have, a text called the Acts of Thomas, written a little over a century after his death, and treated by historians as legend blended with real historical memory. Thomas didn't stay anywhere near familiar territory the way most of the others did. He kept walking east, past the edge of the Roman world, past Persia, past every border the other apostles' missions ever reached, until he arrived on the southwestern coast of India, a community of Christians there. Still called the St. Thomas Christians today, nearly 2,000 years later, with their own distinct liturgy and history, trace their entire origin story back to one doubter who kept walking until he ran out of continent. Tradition holds that he was killed by a spear near what is now the city of Chennai, on India's southeastern coast. The man who once needed physical proof pressed into his own hands before he'd believe anything became the one who carried that belief farther from home than any of the other 11 ever did. Trusting a story, in the end, to people who would never get the proof he once demanded for himself. Think about that the next way you can actually feel it. The way you wait by a phone for news that isn't coming yet. The way you sit in a hallway with no information and just have to decide, without evidence, what you're going to trust. Thomas didn't get his proof easily either. He demanded it outright, refused to move on without it. And once he finally had it, he spent the rest of his life walking towards strangers who would never get what he got, asking them to believe a story he himself had once flatly refused to believe. There's something almost unfair about how history remembers him. 2,000 years later, doubting Thomas is still an insult people use without knowing where it came from. Nobody calls anyone a doubting Peter, even though Peter denied Jesus outright, 3 times, to strangers' faces on the single most important night of the entire story. Nobody calls anyone a doubting Matthew, even though Matthew spent years working directly for the empire that would eventually execute his teacher. Thomas asked one honest question, got an honest answer, and then walked further than any of them to make sure other people got the same chance he did. If any name on this list deserves a better reputation than the one it's stuck with, it's his. That's 12 men, 13 counting Judas, 14 counting Matthias, who started this story as a fisherman, a tax collector, a man the government was watching, a pair of brothers known mostly for their temper, and 2 names history barely bothered to remember. None of them started out looking like the kind of people history would still be talking about 2,000 years later. And here's the detail that ties the whole roster back together, because there's actually a formal requirement buried in the book of Acts for what qualified someone to be counted among this group at all. It comes up in the exact moment the 11 remaining apostles are choosing Judas's replacement. The requirement wasn't credentials, or education, or social standing. It was simple presence. Someone who had been with them the entire time, from the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry until the very end, who had personally witnessed the resurrection. That was the entire bar. Not talent, not pedigree. Just having stayed, watched, and survived long enough to tell someone else what you'd seen. Judged by that standard, every single name on this list qualifies for the same reason. Not because any of them were extraordinary going in, but because they showed up, and they stayed, through parts of the story that would have given any reasonable person an excuse to leave. So here's what's actually true, once you strip away the stained glass. Takeaway 1. Most of what you now know about how these men died isn't in the Bible itself. The New Testament records only 2 apostolic deaths directly and plainly: James by the sword in Acts, and Judas by his own hand in Matthew and Acts. Everything else, Peter's cross, Andrew's X, Bartholomew's flaying, Thomas walking into India, comes from the earliest generations of the church remembering what happened to people they had actually known, or people who had known people who'd known them. That's not weaker evidence than most of ancient history runs on. It's exactly the same kind of evidence historians use for plenty of events nobody questions. And it's worth knowing the difference between what Scripture states outright and what tradition preserved, so you're never confusing the two. Takeaway 2, and this one's for you specifically, whoever's actually listening to this. Every single name on this list started out as somebody with an ordinary job and an unremarkable life. A fisherman mending nets, a tax collector nobody would sit next to, a man radical enough that the local authorities were probably already watching him. 2 men so quiet that history barely wrote their names down at all. Whatever you privately think disqualifies you from being used for something bigger than your own small life. Your job, your temper, your doubts, your past, the thing you did that you still haven't forgiven yourself for. None of it disqualified them. And takeaway 3, the one that actually matters most. Every single one of them, at some point, had a door marked "Recant and Live." Roman soldiers, local kings, angry mobs. They weren't usually interested in killing people who would quietly take it back. Say it isn't true. Say you made it up. Walk away and live out a normal life. 10 of the original 12, by every credible account we have, chose the spear, the cross, the sword, the flaying knife instead of that door. People do not walk toward that kind of death, one after another, on 3 different continents, for a story they privately know they invented. They do that for something they watched with their own eyes and simply could not, in the end, unsee. It's worth pausing on how far that spread actually reached, geographically, because the scale of it tends to get lost. Peter dies in Rome, the seat of empire itself. Thomas dies in India, thousands of miles east, further than almost any first-century traveler from that region would ever go. Bartholomew dies in Armenia, in the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Andrew dies in Greece. Thaddaeus and Simon, by tradition, die somewhere in Persia. These aren't 12 men who stayed close to home and quietly kept a local memory alive. Within a single generation, this group had scattered across 3 continents, carrying the same core claim into cultures, languages, and empires that had nothing to do with the small province of Galilee where it all started. That's not what a locally invented rumor does. That's what happens when a group of people is convinced, individually and independently, that they owe the rest of the world an eyewitness account. So here's the question, and I actually want you to answer it. Out of everyone on this list, the doubter who kept walking farther than anyone else, the loudmouth who got everything wrong until the one night he needed to get it right, the tax collector sitting across a table from a man whose old movement wanted him dead. Which one's ending hit you hardest? Tell me who and why in the comments below. 12 ordinary men, one extraordinary, brutal, world-altering cost. And by every account history left us, every single one of them decided, when the door was actually standing open in front of them, that it was still worth it.